Hello, my name is Haywood Osman, and I'm a technical trainer with Amazon Web Services. In this video, I'll be introducing Amazon API Gateway, a fully managed service that makes it easy for developers to create, publish, maintain, monitor, and secure APIs at any scale. So why are we focused on APIs, and why do we need a service to manage them? Well, as your application evolves, your APIs will proliferate. Let's say that you're building a simple website to sell products on the internet. The first version of your application could be pretty simple. Over time, you discover your customers like pages to load faster, so you move more of your logic into your web front end so that it fetches data automatically in the background without having to reload the web page, making the site feel a lot more responsive. Then you introduce native mobile apps for iOS and Android. To support these different clients, you refactor your backend to expose an API so that your team can reuse a lot of your business logic across different applications. Along the way, your feature set grows and so does your team. You add new features such as recommendations and inventory tracking systems. So you refactor the application into multiple microservices to enable each team to manage and update their service much more rapidly. Your APIs expand. Business is good, and you want to expand further. You start building a marketplace and allowing third-party sellers to list items. Now some of your partners are asking for APIs to help them automate repetitive tasks. In all of these cases, you are building and deploying APIs as part of your software development cycle. You'll have to ensure that the API can handle spikes in traffic gracefully, track API usage by client application via API keys, set up authentication and authorization on specific methods, document the API so others can use it, and that's all before we start talking about maintaining multiple versions of your API to maintain compatibility with older clients as you continue to innovate. This is a common challenge with long-running software products because while customers can work around UI changes, someone has to write new code if you make breaking changes to your API. So how do I create an API and API Gateway? API Gateway can be placed in front of servers that are running on EC2 or running anywhere on the internet. However, the most exciting thing is that API Gateway is a fully managed service, and you can use API Gateway along with other AWS services to build backends for your application that are purely based on managed services. That means there are no servers for you to maintain. API Gateway can proxy requests to Lambda functions that run your code and generate responses. You can even create APIs that proxy requests for other AWS services, such as Amazon S3, without even having to write code at all. This allows you to get production scale backends running much more quickly because there's less code for you to write, and you've offloaded operational burden to the AWS services. Let's take a closer look at how we can get started with API Gateway. We'll define a resource in API Gateway, define the methods on that resource, and deploy it to an API Gateway stage. Here we are at a web page for the API that we're going to build using Amazon API Gateway. And what we can see is this is a simple API for a pet store, and an API can return either HTML or JSON, and in this case we're looking at an HTML file that's been returned by our API. So what I'm going to do now is switch over to Postman and start to interact with our API before we go into Amazon API Gateway and see how we can define APIs like this. So we're going to interact with our API using Postman to make HTTP requests. And the first thing is that we need to have a resource. So here we see a URL for where our API is deployed. And at the end of that API URL, there's a /pets resource that we're going to interact with. And the way we interact with it is we submit an HTTP request, such as a GET request or a PUT request. So to get a list of the pets out of our pet store API, what we'll do is we'll submit a GET request to this URL and see what we get back. Here we see that we get a list of pets that are available. So we have IDs, we have types, and we have prices for these pets. We can also interact with our API by filtering some of the results down by passing in additional parameters like query strings. So here we see parameters have been defined, such as type of pet and page for our API. If I get the first page of results for dogs, I'll see some set of results here with the different prices. And I could go ahead and submit a different request for the next set of results. And those are coming in from query strings. If I wanted to submit a new record for a type of pet, I could use an HTTP post request. And so here, I'm using a different verb to make a request to my API. And I will submit a JSON document to the API for it to be processed. And I get a JSON response back from my API. The next thing that we'll do is we'll see that we can also make GET requests to sub-resources. Like here, I'm going to hit /pets/3 to get the pet corresponding to ID number 3 back from the API. And so here I see that pet ID number 3 is a fish that costs 99 cents. So now that we have a sense of what we're doing with our API, let's switch back over to API Gateway and get started with the sample pet store API. As this is the first API that I'm going to be creating an API Gateway, I'm going to click Get Started, and I'm prompted to create an example API. The first thing that we notice with this example API is that it's defined by this Swagger file. And as you get more proficient with building your APIs, you might find it much more convenient to define your APIs declaratively by using something like a Swagger file and then importing those into API Gateway. So I'm going to go ahead and import this API definition for the pet API. And API Gateway is giving me some hints to walk through the tutorial. As we noted before, the first thing that's important to understand in our API is the set of resources. So we saw earlier that we had interacted with the / path, the /pets path, and the subpath underneath pets that we were using with numbers, such as number 1, 2, and 3 for pet IDs. So the first thing that we can create in API Gateway are these resources. And if I wanted to add a new resource, for example, for pet food, I could go ahead and create resource and then call my resource food and create that new resource path for my API as well. The next thing that we need to think about for our API is how do we define those HTTP verbs that we were using to interact with our API. So I can go back to actions, and underneath my resource, I can create a method. And when I create a method, I get a choice of standard HTTP actions, such as get, put, post, and I could even choose any. And when I do create that new verb, I'm also prompted for an integration. And so here's where I get to define whether I want API Gateway to take the client request and pass it off to a Lambda function or to another HTTP service or to a mock integration, which is really handy when you want to put your API available but your code's not ready yet. So your partners can start to call the API and have static content come back, which is really handy for testing. And the fourth choice here is proxying for an AWS service. So if you wanted to have your users upload files to an S3 bucket or transform the user requests and put them into a DynamoDB table without writing code, you could use an AWS service integration type. In this case, I'll go ahead and use the Lambda function integration. And I also have a choice to use what's called Lambda proxy integration. And when I do that, API Gateway captures all the parameters for the request and forwards them over to my function. Here, I'll go ahead and use a Lambda function that I've predefined just to show you how I can create these types of integrations. And what you'll see for any of these integrations in API Gateway is that we have a first category called the method request. And this is where API Gateway is going to be interacting with the client who's making requests. And you can set things such as authorization options and to also extract parameters from that client request. Then in the next phase, we have our integration request. In this part, we'll take the data that we've pulled from the client request and reshape it before passing it on to the service that is the endpoint for accepting that request. Then on the bottom, we have our integration request, which does this stuff in reverse. So it's able to match the responses that are coming back from your service and then potentially remap those responses before sending them back to your client. Once we have our API defined with our resources and with our methods and with the integrations for those methods, we're not quite done yet. What we need to do is take the API action of deploying our API. Now what will happen is we'll take all of this context that we've defined about our API and we can deploy it to a stage. So a stage could be anything like an environment, like a dev or production environment, or you could also deploy different stages to correspond to versions of your API as well. Here I'll go ahead and create a stage and I'll call it dev, and this is going to be a stage for testing my code in progress. And I also, every time I deploy to a stage, I can provide a description. These descriptions come in handy because as you make deployments to your stages, API Gateway keeps a snapshot of the different deployments you make so that you can roll them back later. And now I've been forwarded along to the stages section. And so this is where I can now see where my API has been deployed. And this is the URL that I can use to invoke my API. I also get control over my stage. such as do I want to turn on things like caching or throttling? And if I need to customize my stage to, let's say, connect to a different database when it's in development stage versus in the production stage, I can set variables that can be used to do that sort of thing. I also get to kickstart my software development cycle because API Gateway can take the definition of my API and allow for me to export some JavaScript or Swift or Java code that can be dropped into an application to speed up that process of having that application call my API. So here I can click Generate SDK. And what you'll find is that as your API evolves and as your application needs evolve, you'll start to find more and more of the functionality of API Gateway to be really helpful. For example, you can start to define the specific data types and validation that you want to have for the incoming requests and the returned results by using models. And you can start to tag your documentation to the methods in the documentation section. And there's a rich set of features to help you manage your API over the life cycle of your project. So that concludes our demo of the API Gateway service. This has been an introduction to the API Gateway service. I hope you'll get to use it on a project soon. This is Haywood Osman with AWS Training and Certification, and thanks for watching.